Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. North Korea fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles, apparently for the first time from a railway-based launch system. The latest test was conducted just 2 days after the regime claimed it successfully test-launched a newly developed long-range cruise missile. Has the North Korean regime started its pressure tactic on the Biden administration? Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Jeffrey Lewis, the director of the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Previously, Dr. Lewis was the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Non-Proliferation Initiative at the New America Foundation. Ian Williams is also with me today. Mr. Williams is fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project, specializing in missile defense and strategic forces, missile proliferation, and deterrence. Welcome to the program. Good to have you both.
Good morning.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
I will start with Dr. Lewis. Many experts predicted earlier that North Korea will likely turn to provocations in the early period of the Biden administration. Can we make of the latest moves by North Korea as the start of such provocations?
Well, I think we're entering a new phase. Whether we call them provocations or not, I think depends on one's point of view. But I think it's very clear, starting with Kim Jong-un's speech to the Workers' Party Congress, that North Korea is moving into a phase in which it is going to step up its production of nuclear weapons, and it's going to increase the number of new missile systems it tests. So I think we're in for sort of an exciting time.
Mr. Williams, why test now? What is their purpose here?
I think fundamentally their motivation is that they're trying to develop a real military capability here that it can use to deter or even preempt a conflict on the peninsula. Unlike his father, who I think used the missile program as a way of getting political leverage and getting attention, I think Kim Jong-un and this regime is very serious about developing a real capability to wage a real war with these weapons.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Williams, so North Korea tested its short-range ballistic missiles just a few days after testing a long-range cruise missile. Why do you think they have tested both in such a short period?
Well, this is certainly the most significant, I think, test that we've seen, particularly since President Biden has taken office. It's otherwise been fairly quiet in terms of their flight testing. Whether we see that, the frenetic pace continue like the frenetic pace we did in 2016 and 2017 is anyone's guess. But, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw, more testing between now and the wintertime. I think the big question is whether it's going to actually get the Biden administration's attention. Right now, I think engaging with North Korea is certainly not something that's been a high priority for this administration.
Right. Dr. Lewis, how do ballistic missiles and cruise missiles function differently? Do they complement each other?
Yes. I mean, there's a reason the United States and most other modern militaries are interested in both. So a ballistic missile, which is really like an object you throw, it goes up and it comes down. And there are some things you can do to make it maneuver or guide it a little bit. But generally speaking, a ballistic missile is going to come in pretty fast. But it's going to follow what's called a ballistic trajectory, like if you're throwing a baseball or something. A cruise missile is much more like a small aircraft. They can also be quite fast, but in general, they tend to be a bit slower. And that gives them the ability to maneuver. And particularly in the very final few moments of their flight, they can sort of adjust course and get higher levels of accuracy. So if you're the North Koreans and you're looking at conducting an attack on U.S. forces in South Korea and Japan, and you are worried about penetrating missile defenses, having a mix of these kinds of capabilities makes a lot of sense for them.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Williams, do you have anything to add to this?
We see two developments here. We see a cruise missile development, and we also see these rail-launched missiles, which I think is also quite significant. It makes a lot of sense, I think, for North Korea to branch out into these kinds of platforms. For one, particularly the rail-launched missiles, these are a bit cheaper and easier to build and deploy than the larger road mobile vehicles. And we know that North Korea has had difficulty in building those kinds of larger vehicles. So putting them on trains, alleviates some of those industrial challenges. But I think maybe more importantly, it complicates the job of anyone trying to knock out North Korea's missiles before they can launch. I think North Korea is very aware that the United States and South Korea are, building up a capability to locate and quickly destroy North Korean missiles before they can launch. So putting these things on trains is one more way of making that task harder.
Dr. Lewis, as Mr. Williams said, the missiles appear to have been launched from a train rather than a transporter erector launcher. What does this tell you?
Well, I agree that the fundamental issue for North Korea is not just building the missiles, it's also building the launcher. And so, one solution is to put the missile on a truck with wheels. But then you have to have really high quality roads, you have to have really strong bridges because these things are very heavy. And you still really can't drive all that fast. So we've seen North Korea kind of struggle a little with that technology. They invest a lot of money into being able to do it. But we've also seen them look at tracked vehicles, right? So basically what you or I would think of as a tank with a missile on it, because the track is a little bit better off-road. So they seem to be struggling with finding just the right system. And honestly, when you were dealing with missiles, which can be quite heavy, and you are a country like North Korea that has not the world's greatest road network, but a pretty good railway network, including a lot of railway tunnels, that is a very appealing solution for them. And so I would expect to see not just this missile based on rails, but a variety of other missiles up to and maybe eventually including a solid propellant missile that's targeted against the United States.
Mr. Williams, in terms of deterrence, are the U.S. and South Korea prepared to respond to this kind of missile launch?
Well, I think, even with these new capabilities, fundamentally, the United States and South Korea have significant military superiority over the North, and that, on most days should be enough to deter a conflict and deter them from using these weapons. But, from a missile defense perspective, I think, South Korea, the missile defenses we have in South Korea are really optimized for ballistic missile defense. A system like THAAD, for example, really has no capability of shooting down a cruise missile, which is the kind of missile they recently tested. The Patriots have a cruise missile capability, but their sensor capabilities again are really optimized for ballistic missile defense. They would have trouble seeing a cruise missile coming since cruise missiles fly so much lower. So moving towards a defensive capability, a missile defense capability that is capable of handling cruise missiles, I think there's going to need to be some work in developing the sensor architecture, and particularly integrating more sensors that are high on aircraft, on UAVs that can look down over the horizon and see these things coming, and they can queue up the missile defense systems to be able to intercept a cruise missile. I mean, one of the interesting differences between a cruise missile and a ballistic missile is pretty easy to see because it flies so high, but it's hard to shoot down. But a cruise missile, because it's slower, it's lower, it's actually easier to shoot down if you can see it. The real challenge with cruise missile defense is seeing them coming.
Actually, it was suspected in South Korea that the U.S. and South Korean military may have failed to detect the cruise missile test. Do you think that was the case?
I think it's very possible. I mean, we didn't really know what we were dealing with until we basically were going off what the North Koreans were telling us. We didn't get any leaks, as far as I can recall, from the South Korean government, which we typically do, or the Japanese. So it's quite possible that they did not see this missile. And particularly if they were flying within the North Korean airspace, it would be hard for sensors based in South Korea or Japan to see that.
I'll turn to Dr. Lewis. What is your thought about the U.S. and South Korea's capability to respond to North Korea's missiles?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge is just exactly as it's been described, which is that, cruise missiles in particular are pretty tough for the systems that we have in place. I honestly think that given the kind of number of North Korean missiles that we're looking at in terms of ballistic and cruise missiles, it's going to be pretty hard for the United States and South Korea to keep pace in an affordable way. And so, I do think that one of the challenges we have is if we don't feel confident about our ability to have entirely defensive measures, then, we start having conversations about going first, right? About being able to preempt some decision and be able to cut Kim Jong-un off from his forces. And so one of the things I'm very worried about in the Korean Peninsula is as North Korea's capabilities grow and we feel compelled to respond to them, that we actually may be building a system that is pretty unstable in a crisis.
Dr. Lewis, from the recent tests, like cruise missile tests and ballistic missile tests, what was most notable to you?
Well, obviously, the development of a 1,500-kilometer range cruise missile is a pretty big step for North Korea. For whatever reason, I don't think people reacted to it with the same alarm that they've reacted to some other systems. But, this is a system that can range U.S. forces throughout South Korea and Japan. And it's likely to be fairly difficult to see coming in. And that's going to make both, warning in terms of getting people to safety pretty tough. And also complicate the task of shooting it down. The rail basing is a different sort of challenge. It just sort of opens up North Korea's options for deploying missiles in new and unusual ways. So maybe I think the thing to say here is that if we step back, it's not so much this capability or that capability, but it's kind of the breadth of capabilities that North Korea is applying and the degree to which that really complicates our planning and our development of capabilities to respond.
And Mr. Williams?
South Korea and the United States have been pretty open about their desire to seek more what we call left-of-launch capabilities, being able to disable or destroy missiles on the ground before they can launch. I think the South Korean SLB and the submarine launched ballistic missile tests, I think, is a big part of that effort as well. So the North Koreans are very cognizant of the fact that their missiles are vulnerable, increasingly vulnerable to these kinds of systems that the South and the U.S. is detecting. So the more they can diversify their launch platforms, be it on trains or on trucks or on submarines, the more resilient they can build that force, more resilient they can make that force to be.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Williams, timing-wise, the ballistic missile tests were conducted during Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Seoul. Do you think this was calculated?
It's quite possible. North Korea is, very sensitive about its relationship with China. That's no secret. And I'm not sure if shooting a missile while the Chinese foreign minister is in Seoul is their way of saying, "Hey, don't forget about us." But that's the Chinese-South Korean relationship is certainly not one that the North wants to see strengthen. Considering that China is really North Korea's one of North Korea's few allies.
Dr. Lewis, do you think North Korea's test was taken by surprise on the Chinese side, or quite the opposite?
Well, it's hard to know. I think that just depends on how the relationship between the two is at any particular moment. I think we have seen in the past North Koreans giving the Chinese heads up for different events. But at the same time, when the North Koreans are annoyed with the Chinese, they sometimes don't tell them and maybe delight a little bit in making life difficult for them. So I don't think we really know, but I think that, the fundamental takeaway from this is I think it's very common for analysts, particularly in the United States, to say that the solution to the North Korea problem lies through China. And I think that's probably an oversimplification. And I think some of the tension we see with the Chinese foreign minister being in Seoul and the North Koreans making that difficult really brings to the surface the fact that it's a more complex and interesting relationship than that simple talking point.
And Dr. Lewis, just after North Korea carried out with their missile test, you analyzed the satellite images and said North Korea seems to be expanding its uranium enrichment plant at Yongbyon. Could you elaborate on your findings?
Sure. When it rains, it pours. We've seen an enormous amount of activity at the Yongbyon complex, where North Korea produces material for its nuclear weapons. And so we've seen North Korea do a reprocessing campaign to separate some plutonium. We've seen them restart the reactor that makes the plutonium. And then what we saw last week was in the portion of the factory that enriches uranium, we think for weapons purposes, North Korea began expanding that facility, basically clearing out an area next to it, opening up the building so there would be access, and then building a wall. And we think they're going to put a roof over it and fill it with about another 1,000 centrifuges. And so that would increase the capacity of that plant at Yongbyon by about 25%. And the reason we think they're doing that is Kim Jong-un in January said they were going to push ahead with production of large thermonuclear weapons. And what that takes is lots and lots of highly enriched uranium. So it's no surprise that he says one thing and then we see the North Koreans doing the thing to follow through on it.
Mr. Williams, if North Korea is indeed expanding their uranium production in Yongbyon, what does this imply?
I think that this is another sign that North Korea is serious about expanding its nuclear weapons stockpile. You know, you have greater nuclear ambitions, you need to fuel those ambitions by creating more fissile material, and this is a big part of that. You know, we've seen North Korea talking now about smaller nuclear weapons that can be used in more tactical settings. You know, building out more larger, thermonuclear weapons, which requires more fissile material. So I think it's part of that. They need the fissile material to do that, and this is how they get it.
Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, South Korea successfully test launched an indigenous SLBM. Mr. Williams, how significant is this? Do you think the North Korean regime is upset by this?
Well, I think it certainly, any military development that South Korea takes is likely to make North Korea more uncomfortable. But I think it's a reaction to the kinds of, diversification and strengthening of the North Korean missile threat. What you get from a submarine launched ballistic missile that you don't get from a ground launch from the perspective of South Korea is you can, the terrain of North Korea is very rugged, and there are some areas that would be difficult to hit with a ballistic missile from just firing from one angle, one trajectory. So SLBM gives South Korea the ability to really promptly strike areas that might be more difficult from firing from the south. Just like why North Korea is developing a submarine launch capability, so they can fire from other angles and try to outflank the missile defense systems in the south.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lewis, will this surely boost up South Korea's deterrence against North Korea's provocation? And are you worried that this could lead to an arms race in the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I don't think we need to be worried. I think we have an arms race on the Korean Peninsula. So whether we like it or not, or worried about it or not, it's underway. I mean, North Korea has been testing so many different systems, and South Korea, honestly, it wasn't just a submarine-launched ballistic missile that South Korea tested. There were a variety of other systems that were shown off. And so I think it's a pretty robust arms race. One of my concerns, though, is that fundamentally, I don't think it makes sense to think of these weapons as deterrence. I mean, it is not as though if North Korea were to decide that it was in such danger that it was going to use nuclear weapons against South Korea, that it would look at a heavy conventional missile payload and feel deterred by that. The real purpose of these systems is to be able to go first and prevent Kim Jong-un from giving that order in the first place. And so it's really not fundamentally about deterrence, it's about preemption. And while I understand why military planners feel compelled to do that, because that's probably the best of a bunch of bad options available to the South Koreans. Again, I think if we step back or we look at it from the perspective of the countries around the Korean Peninsula, this is a really dangerous situation, in my opinion, where both South Korea and North Korea are developing capabilities and plans in a conflict to go first, and one of them is wrong about that.
What we see developing in the Korean Peninsula is not like the kind of deterrence relationship that the United States had with the Soviet Union, where you had strategic weapons and there was a kind of a balance. There is this kind of dangerous dynamic where whoever makes the first move gets a significant benefit, and in some cases, whoever makes the first move might be the one that survives a conflict. So that does not comport with kind of how we understand a stable deterrence relationship to be.
My last question today, Dr. Lewis first. The U.S. continues to emphasize it is still open to talks, although the tensions are being ratcheted up. Are the talks likely?
You can always talk, but I don't think significant diplomatic progress is likely in the near term. And I would say that's for two reasons. One reason, which is probably the most important, is North Korea just restarted its reactor. They will probably want to let that reactor run for about 2 years before unloading its fuel. And North Korea has a large number of systems that have been either under development or completed but not tested during the last few years of diplomacy. And I think the North Koreans want to finish testing those. I agree that this is not about North Korea provoking the United States so much as it is about acquiring real military capabilities to threaten us. And so I just don't think that the North Koreans are in a talking mood at this point. Mm-hmm. And by the same token, I think for the Biden administration, while we have seen some hints that they'd be willing to engage in talks, I just don't think that we have really come around to accepting that the North Koreans aren't going to disarm. And I think until we really understand that what we're engaged with right now is tension reduction instead of disarmament, even if we sit down and talk with the North Koreans, it's going to be a short conversation.
Mr. Williams, do you expect to see any diplomacy happening soon?
I also do not. I think that it's fundamentally that the North Koreans are not serious about giving up their nuclear missile capabilities right now, and I don't think they're going to be until there's a really dramatic fundamental shift in the security dynamics and the relationships in the region. Right now North Korea I don't think has any motivation. They view the Kim regime views that the nuclear missile programs is perhaps more important to their survival as anything. So I think that even things like economic relief or economic aid, I think is to them not worth giving up those programs at this time.
North Korea had launched its missiles when diplomatic efforts were underway surrounding the Korean peninsula, with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visiting Seoul and the US, South Korea, and Japan discussing ways to engage with Pyongyang. Whether the things will be more strained or a breakthrough will be made, it has yet to be seen. Dr. Lewis and Mr. Williams, thank you so much for your time today.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.